Eleanor Donovan's life shattered like glass when the letter arrived on that scorching summer day of 1874, the words blurring before her tear-filled eyes as she learned her fiancé had changed his mind about their marriage, abandoning her just days before she was set to board a train from Boston to meet him in Wyoming territory. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small Wyoming town of Pine Ridge as Eleanor stepped off the train 3 weeks later, her cream-colored traveling dress already gathering dust from the frontier air. She had sold nearly everything she owned to make this journey, ignoring her fiancé's letter and clinging to the hope that seeing her might change Thomas's mind. Now, standing on the wooden platform with only 2 trunks to her name, that hope felt foolish. "Miss, you look a mite lost," came a deep voice from behind her. Eleanor turned to find a tall man with sun-weathered skin watching her with curious eyes. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the badge pinned to his vest identified him as the local sheriff. "I'm looking for Thomas Garner," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He owns the Mercantile, I believe." The sheriff's expression softened with recognition. "You must be Eleanor. Thomas mentioned you might still come despite his change of heart." Her cheeks burned with humiliation. So everyone knew of her rejection. "The Mercantile's at the end of the main street," the sheriff continued, gesturing down the dusty road. "But Miss Donovan, perhaps you should know." "Thank you," Eleanor cut him off, unwilling to hear more about Thomas's decision from a stranger. She gathered her skirts and began the walk into town, leaving her heavier trunk to be delivered later. The Mercantile stood proudly at the end of the street, its freshly painted sign declaring Garner's Goods in bold letters. Eleanor paused outside, her heart hammering against her ribs before pushing open the door. A small bell announced her arrival. Thomas stood behind the counter, his familiar sandy hair neatly combed, his face registering shock as he recognized her. Beside him stood a pretty young woman with golden curls who looked at Eleanor with confused interest. "Eleanor," Thomas stammered, his face paling. You came?" "Yes," she replied, her voice barely audible. "I thought there must be some mistake." Thomas moved from behind the counter, nervously smoothing his waistcoat. "I wrote to you. I explained that circumstances had changed." The blonde woman stepped forward, a diamond ring glittering on her finger. "Thomas, who is this?" Eleanor felt as though the floor had dropped from beneath her feet. "I'm the woman he asked to marry him last winter," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "The woman who sold everything she owned to come here and start a new life." Thomas had the decency to look ashamed. "Eleanor, this is Beatrice Miller, my fiancé. I meant to tell you, but things happened so quickly with her father's investment in the store." Eleanor backed toward the door, fighting tears. "I see. Economics trumps promises, then." "Now see here," Thomas began defensively. "I made it clear in my letter. Your letter arrived 3 days before I was scheduled to depart," Eleanor snapped. "After I had already sold my parents' home and most of their possessions, after I had packed everything I owned. After I had said goodbye to everyone I knew." A tense silence filled the store. Beatrice looked uncomfortable while Thomas's expression hardened. "I'm sorry for your inconvenience," he said stiffly, "but surely you understand that a man must make practical decisions." "Beatrice's father has connections that will help expand the business." Eleanor's hand gripped the doorknob. "Where am I supposed to go, Thomas? What am I supposed to do now?" Thomas glanced at Beatrice, then back to Eleanor. "The boarding house has rooms. Mrs. Wilson is a good woman. I'm sure you'll find work as a seamstress or perhaps a teacher if you've the education for it." Eleanor stared at him, this stranger who bore the face of the man she had loved. Without another word, she turned and fled into the street, colliding with someone just outside the door. Strong hands steadied her as she stumbled. "Whoa there, careful," said a voice like rough velvet. Eleanor looked up into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a face bronzed by sun and weather. The man before her wore a battered hat, a blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up revealing muscular forearms, and faded denims tucked into well-worn boots. A slight stubble shadowed his jawline and a small scar crossed one eyebrow. "I'm sorry," she murmured, trying to compose herself. The man studied her face, noting her distress with a frown. "You all right, madam?" Before she could answer, Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Eleanor, wait." The stranger's gaze shifted to Thomas, his expression cooling noticeably. Garner, he acknowledged with a curt nod. Xavier, Thomas replied stiffly, this doesn't concern you. The man Xavier kept his hands gently on Eleanor's arms as though sensing she might collapse without the support. Seems like the lady's upset. That concerns me plenty. Eleanor pulled away from both men. Please, I just need to find the boarding house. I can take you there, Xavier offered, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Mrs. Wilson's a friend. Thomas stepped forward. Eleanor, at least let me give you some money, for I don't want your charity, she said sharply. Xavier's expression darkened as understanding dawned. This the woman you wrote to, Garner, the one you jilted for Miller's daughter and his money? Thomas flushed angrily. Mind your own business, Jenkins. Not all of us can afford to chase foolish dreams instead of building something real. Xavier Jenkins's jaw tightened, but his voice remained measured when he spoke. Madam, if you'd like an escort to the boarding house, I'd be honored to assist you. Eleanor nodded gratefully, no longer trusting her voice. Thomas called after her as she walked away with the stranger. Eleanor, be reasonable. What did you expect me to do? Xavier stopped and turned slowly. She expected you to keep your word, Garner. Most men around here consider that important. His eyes met Eleanor's, and something in them made her breath catch. Don't you worry, madam. If he changed his mind about marrying you, he paused, his gaze returning to Thomas with unmistakable challenge. Then I'll make up his. The boldness of his statement left Eleanor speechless as he gently guided her down the street, away from Thomas's sputtering protests, and toward an uncertain future, Mrs. Wilson's boarding house stood 2 streets from the main thoroughfare, a 2-story white clapboard building with a wide front porch adorned with potted geraniums. As they approached, Xavier cleared his throat. I should introduce myself properly. Xavier Jenkins. Most folks call me Xav. Eleanor Donovan, she replied. Though it seems you already knew about me, he nodded, looking slightly chagrined. Small town. Word gets around when the mercantile owner writes to break off an engagement. Apparently everyone knew except me, Eleanor said bitterly. Xavier's expression softened. For what it's worth, not everyone agreed with how Garner handled things. Man gives his word, he ought to keep it. They reached the boarding house steps, and Eleanor turned to face him. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Jenkins, but what you said back there. That wasn't necessary. Which part? He asked, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, about making up his mind. Her cheeks warmed at repeating his words. It was gallant, but I'm not looking for another hasty engagement. Xavier removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Miss Donovan, I wasn't proposing marriage, least not right away. His eyes crinkled with gentle humor, but I meant what I said about Garner being a fool. Any man who'd throw away a woman brave enough to travel across the country to start a new life isn't worth crying over. Before Eleanor could respond, the front door opened to reveal a plump, motherly woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a neat bun. Xavier Jenkins, were you going to stand out here all day without saying hello? The woman chided with obvious affection. Xavier grinned. Afternoon, Mrs. Wilson. I've brought you a new boarder if you've got room. Mrs. Wilson's kind eyes assessed Eleanor. Of course I do. You must be Thomas Garner's young lady. Eleanor winced. I was, yes, understanding passed across the older woman's face. Well, come in, dear, you look dead on your feet. She turned to Xavier. Will you bring in her bags? Just this one for now, he said, lifting the smaller trunk. The station master's sending the other. Mrs. Wilson ushered Eleanor inside to a cozy parlor while Xavier carried the trunk upstairs. Sit down, child. You look like you could use some tea. Eleanor sank gratefully onto a chintz-covered settee, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. Thank you, it's been a difficult day. The older woman patted her hand. Thomas Garner always did have more ambition than sense. His mother would be ashamed of how he's behaved. Xavier returned downstairs, hat in hand. Trunks in the blue room, Mrs. Wilson. Thank you, Xavier, Mrs. Wilson disappeared into the kitchen to prepare tea. Xavier lingered by the parlor entrance. Miss Donovan, if you need anything while you get settled, I'm usually around. My ranch is about 3 miles west of town. Eleanor managed a small smile. You've been very kind, Mr. Jenkins. Xav, he corrected gently. And kindness has nothing to do with it, just doing what any decent man would. After he left, Mrs. Wilson returned with a tea tray and sat across from Eleanor. "That's a good man," she said, nodding toward the door Xavier had exited. Lost his wife in childbirth 4 years ago. The baby, too, threw himself into building his ranch after that. Eleanor's heart constricted at this revelation. How terrible. Yes, it was. For a while we all worried about him, but he's come back to himself this past year or so. Mrs. Wilson poured tea into delicate cups. "Now let's talk about you. Can you sew?" "Very well," Eleanor confirmed. "I was a seamstress in Boston," Mrs. Wilson beamed. "Perfect. Pine Ridge desperately needs a good seamstress. Our last one moved to Cheyenne with her husband last spring." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest for the first time since arriving. "Do you think I could establish a business here?" "Absolutely. I have a small room off the kitchen that would make a fine shop if you're interested. Low rent to start until you get established." Eleanor felt tears threatening again, this time from relief. "Mrs. Wilson, I don't know how to thank you." The older woman waved away her gratitude. "Pine Ridge needs more strong women, and anyone who would travel all this way on a promise is strong indeed. Now drink your tea and rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to start your new life." That night, in the small but comfortable blue room, Eleanor wept for the future she had lost and the humiliation she had endured. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was not Thomas's face she saw, but a pair of startlingly blue eyes and a voice like rough velvet promising that someone would keep their word to her. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Eleanor established her seamstress shop. Mrs. Wilson had been right. The town desperately needed her skills, and soon she had more work than she could handle. The women of Pine Ridge welcomed her warmly, though she occasionally caught sympathetic glances or hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. It seemed her story was common knowledge. She saw Xavier Jenkins occasionally in town, and he always tipped his hat politely and asked after her well-being. Once, he brought her a basket of fresh eggs and vegetables from his ranch, claiming Mrs. Wilson had mentioned she was too busy to shop properly. Another time, he fixed the broken hinge on her shop door without being asked. Each encounter left Eleanor with a curious fluttering in her chest that both frightened and excited her. One afternoon in late August, as Eleanor was closing her shop, the door opened to admit Beatrice Miller, now Beatrice Garner. Eleanor steeled herself, forcing politeness. "Mrs. Garner, how can I help you?" Beatrice looked uncomfortable. "I need a dress altered for the harvest dance next month." She hesitated. "If you're willing to take me as a customer." Eleanor maintained her professional demeanor. "Of course, I don't turn away business." As Eleanor took Beatrice's measurements, an awkward silence hung between them. "I want to apologize," Beatrice finally said. "What Thomas did was wrong. I didn't know about you when we began courting." Eleanor's hands stilled. "Thank you for saying that." "He's not a bad man," Beatrice continued hesitantly. "Just ambitious. Father insisted on the marriage before agreeing to invest in expanding the store." Eleanor concentrated on marking the alterations needed. "I understand business considerations. I just wish he had been honest with me sooner." Beatrice nodded, looking relieved that Eleanor wasn't more hostile. As she prepared to leave, she paused. "Will you be attending the harvest dance?" "I hadn't planned to. You should. Everyone will be there." Beatrice smiled tentatively. "Xavier Jenkins has been asking if you'll attend. He's asked several people." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. "Has he?" Beatrice's smile widened. "He has. And Thomas may have made a poor choice, but that doesn't mean you can't find happiness here. You've already made quite an impression on Pine Ridge." After Beatrice left, Eleanor found herself considering the harvest dance with unexpected interest. Perhaps it was time to truly embrace her new life and the possibilities it held. The next day, Xavier Jenkins appeared at her shop just before closing time, looking uncharacteristically nervous. He'd shaved and his dark hair was neatly combed, though he still wore his everyday clothes. "Evening, Miss Donovan," he greeted, hat in hand. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she replied, noticing how the fading sunlight through the window brought out auburn highlights in his dark hair. "I was just finishing up." Xavier cleared his throat. "I was wondering if you'd do me the honor of attending the harvest dance with me next month." Despite Beatrice's hint, Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless at the formal invitation. That's very kind of you, Mr. Jenkins." "Xav," he reminded her with a small smile. "And it's not kindness motivating me, Miss Donovan." The directness of his gaze sent warmth spreading through her. Why is it motivating you then? He considered her question seriously. Because in the 6 weeks you've been here, you've shown more courage and determination than most folks show in a lifetime. Because you smile at children and help Mrs. Wilson with her marketing, even though you're busy with your own work. Because when old Mr. Finch couldn't pay for mending his only good shirt, you did it anyway and told him it was on the house. He paused, a hint of vulnerability showing through his confident exterior. And because every time I see you, I find myself thinking about you long after we've parted ways. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. Then I would be delighted to attend the dance with you, Xav. His smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and grief. I'll call for you at 6 then. Wear something pretty though you'd look beautiful in sackcloth. After he left, Eleanor leaned against the counter, overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Thomas's betrayal still stung, but the pain was fading, replaced by a cautious hope kindled by Xavier Jenkins's honest blue eyes and forthright manner. Over the next few weeks, Xavier courted Eleanor with respectful determination. He took her on drives around the countryside, showing her the beauty of Wyoming territory. He brought her wildflowers and books from his personal library when he learned she loved reading. Sometimes he simply sat in her shop while she worked, carving small wooden figures that he gave to local children. She learned about his ranch, which he'd built from nearly nothing into a modest but successful operation. He told her about his late wife, Sarah, speaking of her with respect and affection that honored her memory without shutting out the possibility of new love. In turn, Eleanor shared stories of her life in Boston, her parents who had died within months of each other 2 years prior, and her dreams of someday having a family of her own. The evening of the harvest dance arrived crisp and clear, with stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Eleanor had made herself a new dress for the occasion, a deep blue that matched her eyes, with delicate embroidery she'd worked on during evening hours after the shop closed. Mrs. Wilson had helped her arrange her chestnut hair in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers from the boarding house garden. When Xavier arrived to escort her, his reaction made all her efforts worthwhile. He stood speechless in Mrs. Wilson's parlor, staring at Eleanor as though seeing a vision. "You are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor took in his appearance as well. He wore a proper suit, probably ordered from back east, and had trimmed his hair. He looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in the formal attire. "You clean up rather nicely yourself, Mr. Jenkins," she teased gently. He offered his arm with a smile. "Shall we give the town something to talk about, Miss Donovan?" The harvest dance was held in the town hall, decorated with autumn leaves, pumpkins, and golden bunting. A small band played lively tunes while couples twirled across the floor. When Eleanor entered on Xavier's arm, conversations paused briefly as people took note of them together. Thomas and Beatrice were among the first people they encountered. Thomas looked stunned at the sight of Eleanor looking radiant and confident, while Beatrice smiled genuinely. "You look lovely, Eleanor," Beatrice said warmly. "That color suits you perfectly." "Thank you," Eleanor replied, surprised to realize she felt no bitterness toward the woman. "Your alterations turned out well." Thomas cleared his throat awkwardly. "Jenkins," he acknowledged with a nod. "Miss Donovan." Xavier's arm tightened slightly around Eleanor's. "Garner, Mrs. Garner." "Pleasant evening." The brief exchange completed, Xavier guided Eleanor away. "You all right?" he murmured close to her ear. Eleanor smiled up at him, realizing with sudden clarity that she was more than all right. "Yes, actually, I'm grateful to him now." Xavier raised an eyebrow in question. "If Thomas hadn't changed his mind, I never would have met you," she explained simply. His eyes darkened with emotion. "Dance with me," he said, leading her to the floor as the band struck up a waltz. Xavier proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding Eleanor confidently around the floor. She was aware of glances and whispers, but found she didn't care. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, she felt truly at home. As the evening progressed, Xavier led Eleanor outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was cool, stars brilliant in the vast Wyoming sky. They walked a short distance from the hall, the music fading behind them. "I've been wanting to ask you something," Xavier said, his voice serious. Eleanor's heart skipped. "Yes," he took both her hands in his. When I first met you, I made a bold statement about making up Thomas's mind. It was presumptuous. It was, she agreed with a small smile, but I meant it, he continued. Not as a rash promise, but as an intention to prove that not all men break their word. He paused, his expression earnest in the moonlight. I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor Donovan. I know it's been only weeks since we met, but I've never been more certain of anything. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Xav, you don't need to say anything now, he rushed on. I know it's soon. I know you came here expecting to marry someone else. I just wanted you to know where I stand, and that I'm willing to wait until you're ready, if you'll ever be ready. Eleanor reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the small scar on his eyebrow. I came to Wyoming expecting to marry a man I thought I knew, who turned out to be a stranger. Instead, I met a stranger who I'm coming to know better each day. She smiled softly. And I find myself falling in love with him too. The joy that transformed Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened with a passion that left them both breathless. When they finally separated, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. I promise you, Eleanor, I will never change my mind about how I feel. She smiled up at him, her heart full. I believe you. The months that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life. Her business thrived, and she became an integral part of Pine Ridge's community. Xavier courted her properly, respecting her need for independence while making his intentions clear to everyone. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony in Mrs. Wilson's garden. Eleanor wore a gown of her own making, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Xavier's ranch hands and most of the town attended, including Thomas and Beatrice Garner, the awkwardness between them having gradually eased with time. After the ceremony, as guests enjoyed the wedding feast, Xavier led Eleanor aside to give her a gift, a small wooden box he had carved himself, inlaid with mother of pearl. Open it, he urged. Inside lay a folded piece of paper. Eleanor unfolded it to find a deed to the building that housed her seamstress shop, now in her name alone. Xav, she gasped. How did you? I've been saving, he said simply. Your business is part of who you are. I wanted you to know that marriage won't change that. Tears filled her eyes. I don't know what to say. He brushed away a tear that escaped down her cheek. Say you'll come home with me tonight and every night after. Say you'll help me fill our house with laughter and children. Say you'll grow old with me. Yes, she whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. To all of it, yes. Later that evening, as they drove to the ranch that would now be their home together, Eleanor looked at her husband's profile in the fading light and marveled at how much her life had changed since that fateful day she had stepped off the train. What are you thinking about, Mrs. Jenkins? Xavier asked, noticing her gaze. I'm thinking about promises, she replied. About a man who changed his mind and the man who made up his. Xavier's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. Best decision Thomas Garner ever made was letting you go. And the best decision I ever made was staying in Pine Ridge anyway, she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. As their home came into view, silhouetted against the setting sun, Eleanor felt a sense of peace and rightness settle over her. The journey that had begun in heartbreak had led her to a love deeper and truer than she could have imagined with a man whose promises, she knew with absolute certainty, would never be broken. Over the years that followed, Eleanor and Xavier built a life together that exceeded both their dreams. Their ranch prospered, and Eleanor's seamstress business expanded to include ready-made clothing and fabric imports. They welcomed 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew strong and true under the Wyoming sky, learning the values of hard work, honesty, and keeping one's word. Sometimes, when Xavier thought Eleanor wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her with the same wonder in his eyes as on the day of the harvest dance. And on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, they would sit together on the porch of their ranch house, Eleanor's head on Xavier's shoulder, their fingers intertwined, watching the stars come out over the land they both had come to love, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together. For Eleanor had indeed found her true home not in a place, but in the heart of a man who had seen her worth from the first moment they met, and had kept every promise he ever made to her.